Good evening and welcome. Before we begin our discussion this evening, a note of caution. The content of our discussion will involve references to language and terminology relating to mental illness that some audience members may find distressing or triggering. The intention of our discussion is to explore the challenges of using historical terminology in contemporary contexts, its impact, and the importance of recognizing the power of language to challenge stigma. If you feel you need to speak to someone, we're sharing the contact details for support organizations on screen now. We will display those contacts again at the end of our discussion this evening. But before I introduce you to our wonderful contributors to this discussion, I want to give you some background on Grangegorman Histories. Some of you may not be familiar with Grangegorman, which is a suburb on the north side of Dublin City, bordered by Stoneybatter, Phibsborough, and Cabra. Over the past 250 years, the area has been the site of a workhouse, a prison, and a hospital. The site is currently being redeveloped as a health and education campus for the HSE, the Technological University of Dublin, and the local community. For many people historically, Grangegorman was synonymous with a large psychiatric hospital located in the area. It was originally the Richmond Lunatic Asylum, later the Richmond District Lunatic Asylum, then the Grangegorman Mental Hospital, and finally St. Brendan's Hospital. The Richmond Lunatic Asylum opened in 1814 and St. Brendan's Hospital closed in 2012. Grangegorman Histories is a public history project of Dublin City Council, Grangegorman Development Agency, the HSE, local communities, the National Archives, the Royal Irish Academy, and the Technological University of Dublin. The project provides opportunities to contribute to the important work of uncovering, cataloguing, and commemorating the eventful history of this site and the surrounding area. Key amongst the values of this project is a commitment to making the project relevant, acknowledging the complex nature of our past, and to help destigmatize mental illness and institutional confinement. In the later years of St. Brendan's existence, a team of dedicated individuals working in the hospital began the remarkable task of sourcing and recovering the complete records of the hospital activities from 1814. With assistance from the National Archives, where these records are now stored, the archives have been recovered and restored, and they are available for reference. These records illustrate an extraordinary continuous narrative of how people with mental illness came to be admitted to this institution, how mental illness and the institution were regarded by society, and how treatment for mental illnesses evolved over the lifetime of the institution. The records document the lives of the people and the practices in this asylum from 1814. There's work being done by the HSE and Grangegorman Histories to establish appropriate protocols for access to these and other mental hospital records. One of the questions we'll be asking this evening is, how can information documented in these archives help with the contemporary challenges of the stigma associated with mental illness, and contribute to a progressive and compassionate approach to mental health and mental illness in Ireland into the future? Early in the project's work, it became clear that there is a significant challenge in balancing the access, use, and publication of the documents in the archive with state and civic commitments to destigmatizing mental illness, and the language and terminology used in the records, and indeed the titles of the institutions themselves, seem to contradict these values. Now I want to introduce you to our expert witnesses, as it were, who are people who are going to talk to us about this from a position of some eminence. We have Professor Brendan Kelly, who many of you will know, Professor of Psychiatry at Trinity College Dublin, Consultant Psychiatrist at Tala University Hospital in Dublin, and UCD visiting full clinical professor at UCD School of Medicine and Medical Sciences. Professor Kelly has researched and published a series of books and articles on the history of psychiatry and mental illness in Ireland, including Hearing Voices, The History of Psychiatry in Ireland, published in 2016, Mental Illness, Human Rights and the Law, published in 2016, and wonderfully, The Doctor Who Sat for a Year, one of my favorite titles, favorite books, published in 2019. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, and Trinity College Dublin. In 2017, he became editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry. Rick Rossiter is from Newfoundland in Canada, living in Ireland since 1997. Wonderful place, Newfoundland. I had the privilege of visiting it some years ago. Through his lived experience of bipolar and borderline personality disorders, he's a mental health advocate and consultant, writer and blogger, and has worked with Sea Change, Shine, Headline, Aware, eHealth Ireland, First Fortnight, Reach Out, and Mental Health Reform. He's an ambassador for both Sea Change and Aware, and is also a committee member of Refocus, an organisation composed of carers, service users, and psychiatrists working to develop new approaches to psychiatric training. And last but not least, Alan Phelan has worked as both a visual artist and an archivist for over 25 years. While both jobs inhabit different professional spheres, both influence each other greatly in his practice. He approaches historical references from a counterfactual perspective, often placing things out of context and time to explore underlying cultural, social, and political issues. Recent work includes the award-winning 2016 film on Roger Casement, Our Kind, for the Hugh Lane Gallery, and more recently a sculpture in front of City Hall, commissioned by Dublin City Council and Sculpture Dublin, launched in early October. His work with the Grangegorman Development Association in 2015, The Possibility of an Archive, explored the language used in the former asylum registers and was rendered as an outdoor projection on Culture Night. Now, to start us off, I'm going to give a little memory of my own. When I first started working in the National Archives many years ago, the biggest set of records that everybody looked at then in terms of people coming in through the door were the 1901 and 1911 census returns. And I remember looking at them for the first time and seeing the terms idiots, imbeciles, and lunatics used quite conventionally to describe people living in institutions or in households at the time. I also observed there were a number of lunatic asylums in the country, full of people described in similar ways, but also people suffering from, quote, melancholia, quote, mania, quote, neurasthenia, and other terms which can correspond sometimes roughly to psychiatric terms used today. During my childhood, it was quite commonplace to hear terms like idiot, lunatic, and imbecile as terms of abuse. In Ireland, we elided the term idiot down to the word eejit, which denotes foolishness rather than mental illness. I'm not sure that's a get out of jail card, but it's an interesting distortion, if you like, of the word. But there's no doubt that the common usage of these terms stigmatize people with mental illness, whether in institutions or in households and communities. Today's discussion is intended to interrogate stigma through language and hopefully lessen that stigma through ventilating its use over the years. Now, I sort of purposefully began with that story because I suppose one of our big issues is going to be discussing what words mean at different times in history and whether these words can be seen as categories of mental illness as it was understood at the time, and whether their use in writing about that history is justified because of that, or whether they were intentionally stigmatizing. It's another potential issue. And if so, should they be eliminated from our discourse altogether? Like one of the terms that's come under increasing scrutiny recently is the term illegitimate, which of course was applied legally to children in Ireland until the late 80s, and which of course shows up in all of the documentation about children born outside marriage before a certain date. Is it okay for historians to use that term with inverted commas to describe or to change that term to children born outside marriage? These are the kinds of things we're going to be looking at. Brendan, first of all, you are, I suppose, a person who has come slap bang up against this issue, precisely because you inhabit two worlds. One, you're an eminent practicing psychiatrist and teacher, and two, you're an eminent historian of mental illness. So in the work that you've been doing, this has occurred to you, no doubt, on many occasions. So I think perhaps just tell us what you think about those terms as categories or as stigmatizing words, whatever. Give us your views about all of that.
Well, thank you very much, Catriona, for that introduction. And this is clearly a hugely important topic, both now and when we look back historically. And I guess these two things are a little bit different. The terms you mentioned there, idiot, imbecile, and lunatic. Like almost all such terms, they were introduced with very good intentions. So those terms were a way to differentiate between people who appeared to have developed mental illness, as we would now say, and people who appeared to have been born with an intellectual disability. And the terms came into use really in the 1700s and 1800s in a big way as so-called mental hospitals. And there we are again with the language. As so-called mental hospitals were built, and there was an effort to, if you like, diagnose or figure out, who would benefit from being admitted to them and who wouldn't. So, but as time went by, all three terms, idiot, imbecile, and lunatic, became very, very stigmatized. And this happens constantly. This happens with virtually all new terms. They seem to have a half-life, if you will, during which time they are seen as enlightened and acceptable. And that remains the case today with the terminology that is used and that is evolving. And of course, in addition to the language used, the attitudes underpinning the language matter hugely as well. And we can see this today as a psychiatrist in, say diagnosis, all these diagnoses that we now have. We had manic depression become bipolar disorder, and various other diagnoses emerge. And a great deal depends upon how the terms are used. I've seen I've seen diagnostic terms used in a disempowering and stigmatizing way, but I have also seen diagnostic terms used in an empowering, explanatory, sort of networking way that was really, really positive. So there is the language which clearly evolves, but also the way in which it is used is more difficult to write down, but it matters overwhelmingly as well.
Okay. You were describing there the sort of evolution of certain terms into other ways of saying things. And you said an interesting thing, that all of these terms tend to have a half-life when they're seen as enlightened and okay, and then they too fall into disarray. Would it be true to say that psychiatry as a science is a more fluid science in lots of ways? We would expect it to be, I guess, than something as straightforward as engineering or physics or chemistry or any of the other things where you have sort of fixed points. Well, not much in physics, which is becoming more bizarre by the moment, but in terms of psychiatry, our view of the human mind has changed enormously since the 1911 census, even, when Freud was still alive and starting to write some of his great works. And yet that terminology is now disparaged and regarded as insulting and wrong. Do you think the same thing is going to happen to terms we use now? That at some point bipolar disorder will become a term that people won't want to have applied to them any longer? I'm going to ask Rick the next question, Richard. Answer that first, then I can ask you this person will enlighten us most about that.
Yes, is the answer to your question. Let's go for a really straightforward answer here. The language will change, it will evolve. It can evolve owing to social factors, to stigma, to changes in general language use, but it also might evolve if science progresses. Psychiatry is more fluid because the diagnoses, if we agree that there are diagnoses at all, it's all based on symptoms. There are no brain scans or blood tests for any of what we currently call mental illnesses. They are all based on symptoms, and these borderlines shift over time. So there is a great deal more fluidity. Looking at the current state of contemporary neuroscience, there's really very little prospect of coming up with a more, if you like, nailed down biological basis for diagnosis. So it will remain symptom based. And as a result, there will continue to be, iterations of the diagnostic manuals. Now, it's very important that we remember these are collections of symptoms, not biologically defined disorders. So on the one hand, one might argue that diagnosis is a bad idea to begin with, and that the terminology is therefore flawed. But on the other hand, there is no denying, if you like, the suffering and the pain in conditions like schizophrenia, for example. So there does need to be some way of shaping our knowledge, shaping our understanding, shaping our treatment. But the diagnoses are things that we should hold lightly. I'm holding my hand up as if there's, say, an egg or something in it, that they're not rigid, they're negotiable, and they're really tools for dialogue and for guiding understanding and treatment. The more tightly we hold on to them, the more stigmatizing they become.
Very good answer. Rick, if I can turn to you, as someone who yourself has experienced mental illness and who is not in any way ashamed of it, which I think is a wonderful message to send to people. I mean, I'm going to announce now I had serious problems with mental illness myself when I was younger. I got through it. I'm fine. In many ways, I value that experience being something that taught me a great deal about myself and how I related to the world. You've been doing that not just in terms of your own work on yourself, but also to help others. So you're very well placed to tell us about how terminology and the new terminology that is applied to you and to others affects actual patients, as it were. That's probably the wrong word. People who have issues with mental illness. You're going to have to instruct us a little about what the correct terminology is for all of that. Would you like to tell us how you feel about these questions?
Language in as we know, it's evolved over time, just as itself, psychiatry has evolved, and the way patients are viewed and the way families view patients, and how we all sort of had this conversation where we really want to understand ourselves and understand the language around us. But when it comes to like the diagnosis, whether it's bipolar or schizophrenia and other ones, when these words are used in a natural conversation, I find to describe something. Like I was watching a show the other day on an American news channel, and they described the political climate as being schizophrenic, and the way they were describing it would give no other leeway to understanding that what they were meaning for their using schizophrenic was really chaotic and dangerous. And that's how the word is being used now. It's as soon as you hear that word, it's like a barrier has gone up, and there's an alert system going around in your mind saying, this is a dangerous word. I got to listen to what's going on, because that is how it's used today. Just like bipolar and other diagnoses are used in a natural conversation. And the way we use it now, just describe everything, is whether we use the word crazy or psychotic or lunatic, anything could be applied to it. Like, he's a lunatic, the weather's crazy today, everything's sort of bipolar and shifting and changing. So we use it. It is so integrated in our language today. It's one of the last vestiges of language that we apply to everyday life or everyday likenesses that we that is still so ingrained into our society that I don't know how we're going to really evolve away from it. I can understand certain terminologies like bipolar and schizophrenia, that we can sort of lighten and educate people around these words and their uses and how they could be done. But when it comes to words like crazy and other words that we use to describe actions and inactions, people and places, it's going to be a very hard fine line to do that. I know we can use the word stigma and say that overuse of certain words can be damaging to people. And I know for sure, like, if you were somebody raised with always being told you're crazy or everything that you do is crazy, then the word crazy is going to be your triggering point. It's going to be something that's really damaging to you. But on a normal conversation, we don't think about these things. We don't think of how we use them. And I know people even use today terms that are sort of like have been phased out or will be phased out, like the term, retard or faggot and other words that are just slowly leaving our consciousness as being, we still do it. We still subconsciously would say something like that. And it, by no means of harshness, it's just that this is how we were raised and sort of like imprinted on how we do things. So we are evolving away from it. I'm not saying we won't, but it's going to be a very fine line on how we're going to do it and how we're going to use this terminology, and how, whether we really take offense to something when we shouldn't. I don't want it to go that way.
You're a remarkably wise man. It's difficult when something is so integrated. And you made a good point. I mean, when we look at the LGBTQ plus community, when we look at anti-racism, when we look at feminism, the way the terminology has changed because of those movements, precisely because people took action to say you cannot say that, is interesting to look at. But it's also interesting that some of those communities have reclaimed terms of abuse and wear them as badges of honor, like some African Americans use the N word as a word that they're allowed to use about themselves and each other, but they don't want any white person using it. Similarly, the word queer has become a very respectable academic term now, encouraged by gay people who want to return it to a position of pride rather than stigma. I suppose it sort of brings up the question of ordinary conversation, which is something you were talking about there very eloquently, Rick. If you're sitting in a bar, having a conversation, you may not know everything about everyone who's there. And because there is still, I hope, do we all agree that there is still a certain stigma attached to mental illness in our society? Yeah. I mean,
most definitely.
Yeah, people are not likely to disclose that fact until they're in a situation where they can trust whoever they're talking to. Where you have a bunch of people chatting, using the terminology as something is crazy or describing America as schizophrenic. America is a lot of things at the moment. Schizophrenic is probably not the best word to describe it. But I suppose language kind of dissolves in the face of some of the horrors we're seeing in the United States. So it's kind of hard to figure out what to call it. Is a person who, as you say, may be triggered by use of that language, what's the best course for them to take in the case of an ordinary interaction or conversation where people are using language that upsets them? It's hardly appropriate to say, hey, by the way, although it may be, I've had mental illness and I'm finding what you're saying disturbing. Would you like to think about it? Which is the way most people have challenged that kind of talk in the past, particularly racist talk. What would you think, Rick?
Yeah, most definitely. It is a hard challenge to come across, to convey to somebody when you don't really want them to know things, in a sense. Yeah. Like you are in a box yourself, trying to sort of keep everything together and mainly hidden, depending on the situation that you're in. And, you don't want to advertise, but you also want to feel as if anybody, like, I wouldn't want to be in a conversation where race is being disparagingly, talked about. And I will vocally say, yeah, I'm not really comfortable with this conversation. I don't believe in it or something like that. Or I've walked away from these situations. And I feel as you should be able to do the same when somebody is, or could be talking about mental health or somebody's mental health issue in a bad way. Like there should be respect somewhere along the lines. And we're seeing ourselves divulging away from these things because we sort of trip ourselves into words and terminology like the new one, Karen, or, Ken, or whatever the Americans are using and all that, like to just automatically, oh yeah, that's a woman, that's just off the rails and all that. But I've looked at a lot of these videos, and a lot of these videos show somebody going through a mental health crisis, but yet it's put on display so easily. And it's almost disheartening to see things going on like this. But yeah, language and imagery is very much so a way to change how we perceive things and how we talk about things.
I suppose an important point you brought up, which I was going to get to at some point, is social media, which is so much more exposing of people's secrets and ordinary privacy to which they're perfectly entitled. It's very good to see that Congress are hearing from a serious whistleblower at Facebook at last to actually expose some of the stuff that's going on there, not least of which is capturing people in great distress when they should have absolute privacy about these things. Alan, moving on to the wonderful and marvelous area of the arts, which you've been engaged in a really interesting way for a very long time. The piece that you did for the Grangegorman Development Association in 2015, before I think we really got started on Grangegorman Histories, dealt with the actual archival records of the mental hospital. How did you find dealing with those, and what was it inspired you to do this? I presume it was a commission from the GDA, but was it your idea or their idea to work with the archives?
It was Jenny Houghton who invited me to do a piece for Culture Night, so it was going to be a very short engagement or a presentation. But I was kind of wheeled over to a room full of stuff, and then sort of, told to look at it and what would you do with this? Which was just like, I would do nothing with it. This is none of my business. And as I work as an archivist, dialing here from the archive of the Erasmus Smith School's archive in Rathgar, I wear two hats all the time, and it's that sort of knowledge of being a practicing archivist makes me very cautious about dealing with records like that, and especially when there's the access to it was incredibly complex and difficult, and much more difficult than it had previously been. There had been kind of a wide door policy prior to GDA arriving and stuff. So there was previous projects with artists where they had used personal records, which was really unethical in many respects. So I was kind of more interested in a way of kind of capturing the complexity of the situation in some way through a display of text. So it just captured elements of the registration process for patients across 2 centuries. So just accessing 4 different registers. And the HSE, through various meetings, wouldn't let me use any patient information. The doors are firmly closed on any kind of access. And this is also kind of pre-GDPR as well, in some respects. That came in a few years later. So I was just, even that information of just using the categories that patients, or as they're now called in latter records, sort of, I think they're called users or service
users, yeah,
rather than patients now, since you asked earlier, or something like that. But was enough information in these categories to actually reveal a huge amount of how the language that categorized the various kinds of illnesses. And that was really fascinating and enough. So I had, there was the display that had the categories from these registers going down, and then they were flanked either side by text going up of contemporary language keywords from the mental health kind of area and education. So there was a lot of words flooding this building, which was a utility building that's now been covered up. But I mean, what I found really interesting was how the language evolved from being very, very cold to being very inclusive, and even into the early 20th century. So you have there's more personal information recorded, and the detail is more individualistic, because initially it starts off as being very much the patient is isolated, and the information is surrounding them. It's the magistrate or the person who incarcerated them. It's their religion, their marital status, and all that information disappears over the centuries. So by the end of, in the 1810s, for example, just a simple thing, you're asked religion, and there's 3 types of religion listed. By the 1971 records, there's no mention of religion at all. So there's a whole kind of different kinds of categories that evolved to just describe society at the time as well, which is really interesting. And you can learn a lot from this outside of the forms that were filled out, or the ledgers that were filled out, contain horrendous descriptions of people, and the words that are used to describe various ailments, to be very, very vague about it, are kind of jaw-dropping in many respects. But a lot of that, the sequence of words as well were then countered by contemporary archive closure kind of words, like redacted and confidential and inaccessible and hidden and classified and undocumented and encrypted, as a way of describing how these words led to nothing, that there's no information available. But there's so much, it's so rich even describing that absence of information. As I'm sure you know, archives are incredibly interesting in terms of their absences. It's the things that are missing from archives are super fascinating, and part of even though it sounds ridiculous, the richest things are the things that are missing, and finding those gaps within the information reveals a huge amount in terms of any kind of historical analysis or archive investigation or research project.
You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, as you know, I'm sure, Alan, we managed to blow up 800 years of our records in 1922. We still have a wonderful guide to it all, made in 1919, 3 years before the conflagration. So we know what was there, and it's still, to me, a heartbreaking book to read, because
But there's that amazing reconstruction project at the moment as well.
That's right. Peter Brook's fantastic.
It's extraordinary what they're trying to do in terms of rebuilding that building digitally and fill it full of information again. It's
a brilliant idea, and it's one of the values of digitization that we're able to do that now. Yeah. Another value of digitization, I suppose, to stay with the archival element of this, is that when you digitize things like systematic records, like registers of admission to a mental hospital, it gives you the opportunity to manipulate the material. If names need to be redacted, they can be. If other information needs to be redacted, it can be. And you can play around with it in statistical ways that you couldn't otherwise do without a great deal of hard work. I mean, I don't know where you would stand or where any of you, I think I know Brendan's views on this, but I would be very much an advocate of opening records as far as possible, including patients' records, consistent with the right to privacy and obviously GDPR and data protection. We're working at the moment on trying to get a 100-year rule for mental hospital records here in Ireland, which means anything more than 100 years old should be open without restriction. And at the core of this is not just the scholarly urge and desire to be able to write about not just general themes, as Brendan has done so brilliantly, and he has also written about individual cases, which is what makes this human for us, I suppose.
Yeah.
We're hoping that will happen, and we're hoping that there'll be limited access for records more than 50 years old, with certain safeguards in place. What you, as an archivist and as somebody who works in the arts as well, which is you've got two branches here. You've got a classification side, which is the archive side that I know very well, and then the creative side that comes with the arts, which is the imaginative function there. What do you think of the idea of records that are, say, more than 100 years old being open for anyone to see relating to people in mental hospitals?
Well, I think with a lot of art projects, context is everything. And it's not just, it's context and control. A lot of these records reveal elements of control and power struggles and all the rest of it in terms of institutions. But you've got to be respectful and you've got to be able to deal with it. And there's, I mean, the guidelines for this vary all across the world. There's some amazing artists dealing with patients, working with mental health patients, making contemporary art projects. Like there's an artist from Venezuela called Javier Tellez, who's done incredibly important work. Both his parents were psychiatrists, so he grew up in mental health institutions as his home. So he's very, very well versed in it, but he's done enormous amount of work with patients in videos that are super complex. And you just, I don't know, it takes a certain kind of person, to a certain kind of artist who can deal with that effectively and ethically, because he seemingly would be somebody who'd be breaking all the rules. But I think it's the way that the information is used, it's the way that it's creatively then transformed into something else. That's the task. And I think there's a trust issue with health authorities to allow that to happen, that clearly I encountered a big, huge wall that was just like, you cannot do this, you cannot use it. People will be offended. And I think with, a lot of the job of any of these, if you're dealing with public records like this, you're in the public art realm, there's a lot of explaining involved. There's a lot of engagement that's now become more and more important in how art is explained, but how it's transmitted and how it's presented, that it's always given a very rich context so that people understand it better, because we can't assume that everybody understands contemporary art at all, because most people don't actually. And there's a lot of very really clever people trying to tackle these ideas in a very creative way, in a very brilliant way, that kind of challenge notions of academia and structures and the way things are understood. And it's only through those challenges that you really kind of begin to develop as a culture and a society as well, and overcome a lot of these barriers and these, I mean, I even hate the word like that, triggering, in terms of what that means and what that implies, that people are somehow kind of vulnerable constantly. Everybody's vulnerable. It's like, that's a horrible way to just assess a population, that we're all kind of potentially triggered by something, but that's the way we describe ourselves right now. That's the way that we encounter contemporary culture, is that there is this sort of hyper awareness of offense, which doesn't always have to be, we have to sort of overcome that and evolve, in the way that we're describing language, and get past that and through it and end up in a better place that is rich and complicated and difficult and messy. And that's what culture is. It's not clean and easy and straightforward. Nothing is.
It's not. But then things like racism and homophobia and stigmatizing of people with mental illness are things we have to challenge.
Yeah.
I'm the least politically correct person probably on this panel. But I still get it that I do not want to be saying things that are just plain wrong and hurtful.
And it's context and self-awareness as well. I mean, you have to know what you're saying and I kind of accept that of you, because that but you're not trying to offend me, but you're also not constantly apologizing as well.
Yeah, the balance is all, as it often is.
It is, and it's there to be made and there to be kind of achieved and acknowledged and attempted, at least, not ignored.
I'm interested in that sort of, we are talking about, like, stigma is a real thing. And it has operated throughout human history in various ways, most notoriously, I suppose, towards people of color, towards women to a large degree until the 20th century in most cultures, and also towards people with mental health issues. Although sometimes in history, people with what we deem to be mental health issues now would have been elevated as people with insights into how the world operates and all of that.
Exactly.
History of all of that is something that can inform the way we see things now. Brendan, I don't really want to land you with this, but again, maybe to talk to us a little about the fact that you have grappled with these issues of the opening of records that could be seen to be stigmatizing and difficult. And where what Alan has just described, in a way, bespeaks a fear on behalf of the custodians of the records about releasing radioactive information that may damage people, which should be the exact opposite of thinking, why should anyone be ashamed of this? Why should anyone be ashamed of it? Where would you stand now on all of that? You've been really to the fore about opening up the discussion about mental illness and its treatment here, and looking at the historical records. So just give us your thoughts on where we are right now and all of that.
Well, I think your point about this anxiety being largely on the part of the custodians of the record is very telling. Just as a lot of the concern about triggering that Alan was referring to, the concern is on the part of the people who might trigger rather than those who might be triggered, if you know what I mean. The concern about releasing records comes not really from those to whom the records relate, but those who hold the records. And I think there is a reluctance, if you like, to admit that I might say the wrong words, I might use the wrong language, and I'm sorry if I do. I expect and hope to be corrected. And then for those who are offended or upset by the poor use of language, that they would correct, and that would be an exchange that would happen. Like, I can't live my life for fear of saying the wrong word, but I would like to live my life, and if I say the wrong word, be corrected, if you know what I mean, rather than living in a state of continual tension and essentially then saying nothing, releasing no record ever to anyone about anything. I think and you'll be familiar with the greatest example in Ireland to date, Catriona, which was the census records from 1901 and 1911, and the similar concerns that people's names, addresses, family structures in a way, and so forth, would suddenly be public knowledge, perhaps in the context of the census and available online. And to the best of my knowledge, and you can correct me on this, Catriona, this did not produce an avalanche of or an army of the offended, did it?
On the contrary, I had one phone call after I put the census online from a woman who said, "You'd better take this down because it tells people details of my family." I said, well, every Tom, Dick and Harry in Ireland could come into the National Archives since 1961, believe it or not. We are total outliers in access to the census records, and find out about your family. And obviously that wasn't a problem for you until now. And she said, it's a problem now because you're making it easier for you. And I thought, well, I'm sorry, the whole country is delighted with this, and I'm afraid your objection will have to be overruled. But what was fascinating to me as well was precisely on the topic we're discussing today, people found out all kinds of things about their families that they didn't know. And it was that length of time ago that the oral record in the family might have failed or the story didn't get carried through, including the fact that there were people in families with mental illness. What amazed and enthused me was that when people tracked down a relative in a mental hospital, say, they were delighted to find them. It was the finding of them that was important. Then they were interested in all the stuff around it and to know more about where they were and what sort of treatment they might have got, which of course they can find out from your book, and how they were categorized and so on. And it raised, the great thing about the census is it raises far more questions than it answers. And it's for the families looking at them to finish the story, if you know what I mean. But a lot of that was around the business of having a family member who had a mental illness of some sort, either in the household, which many did, or in one of our packed institutions. We had more people in mental hospitals in Ireland at the turn of the last century than anywhere else in Europe, because we have an astonishing appetite for incarceration. It raises its own questions about whether people are as sick as they are mooted to be, or what else is going on here. And that, in my view, is one of the reasons we badly need access to the records of mental hospitals, to find out exactly what was going on. To what extent are people in these hospitals for reasons that have nothing to do with actual mental illness, but societal issues of other kinds? All that kind of stuff is there. Just quickly, Brendan, what would your practice be using words like lunatic, imbecile, idiot, melancholic, manic, which are less, I suppose, they're less. Melancholia is a beautiful word. I've always thought it's a 16th century sort of construction, and it's really beautiful. And I don't mind being called melancholy. I think I'd prefer not to be called depressed, or whatever way it goes. How is a historian or an artist like Alan supposed to deal with these words in the present day? Should you see them as stigmatizing and therefore taboo, or should they be used in inverted commas with contextual explanations?
Well, from the academic point of view, there is guidance about this. The American Psychological Association, the APA, has a publication guideline that says authors are encouraged not to perpetuate demeaning attitudes and biased assumptions. However, they are very clear that quotations, from archives and historical text should not be changed to accommodate current sensibilities. They do advise using asterisks and footnotes to indicate that, a certain historical term is no longer in common use or in clinical use, but they're adamant that substituting words into quotations or records from the past will distort meaning. So they're very clear. Quotations should not be changed to accommodate current sensibilities, but it is wise, and this is what I try to do, to indicate an awareness. This is an historical term. It is not currently used in this fashion, but its use in its context is interesting and it has meaning, even though it's stigmatizing today.
Wonderful answer. And it's great to know that there is such guidance available for writing about these matters. Rick, back to you. We're probably going to have to wind this up fairly soon. Do you have a view yourself on historical terms as opposed to current terminology that's used about mental illness? Would you be happy, for example, what Brendan has just outlined to us there as a sort of guidance for writing about the history of mental illness?
Well, definitely, yeah. There's no sense in whitewashing or trying to erase what we've seen. It shows the evolution, I find, in the conversation, in the language, how it's changed over time. If we sort of, as you would say, censor it or turn it into something that it's not going to educate us anymore. It's just going to be demeaning to just try and put almost like a trigger warning on every vocal word that we say in case somebody gets offended by it. It's not going to teach anyone in the historical context. I'm not going to look back and say, Mein Kampf should be just sort of erased from history because it didn't exist. It did exist, just the way we did talk about mental health in a certain way. And even now, I can't change the fact that I may use a certain word to describe something, but somebody may find offense to it. Trigger warning is a good way of helping somebody to understand that something could come up that they may be offended and all that, but we can't put a trigger warning on everything we do in life. I did not grow up in a trigger warning society, even though there was probably some things that sort of threw me a bit back, but I had to catch myself for it. And, at least with the trigger warning onto this context for your records and to show people that, this is what happened, this is how it was. You can't erase that fact. I just hope that people will sort of like get to the point where they're not going to be so, disturbed over this language, because it is a teaching tool, I find anyway.
Okay, that's a really good answer. I think we're all, well, I'm not, but the three of you are very wise people who know whereof you speak, and you're giving us some very good guidance on where all of this goes. Last question. Well, two last questions. First one, what about the representation of mental illness in popular culture and how that works? I remember seeing the movie about Francis Farmer. I can't remember the title of the movie. Jessica Lange was the star, which was one of the first movies where they looked at the actual treatment of somebody in a mental hospital. This was in the 1950s when things were much worse than, I hope, much worse than they are now. And it had a huge effect on me. Similarly, the novel I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, which was about the mental illness of a young woman, which I read when I was in my teens and was very struck by. And do those representations encourage empathy, understanding, or do we see far more representations that are stigmatizing, inaccurate, and wrong? Anyone want to start on that? Alan?
Well, I think there are representations of the extremes of humanity, of the range of humanity. So without I think certain popular representations excel on notions of madness and what we were calling crazy and stuff as a way of just, it's heightened emotions, it's tension, it's stress, it's murder, it's mayhem. And these things are what drama's made of, It's been with us forever. So I think within the discussion around these mental health institutions, you cannot escape the sort of the constant thing that I come back to is control. It's about the control of people. It's about all that stuff that Michel Foucault's on about, which I know is contentious in terms of psychiatry and stuff, but it's about organizing madness. It's about controlling a population. Which resulted in this like crazy over incarceration in terms of the numbers of Ireland. It's about being able to just try and wage some sort of control over the population, which is super fascinating. And if anything, popular culture kind of tends to reveal that and show it for its flawed nature. If that's a good thing, whether it's entertainment, and it is often entertainment. Like I was just thinking, like, what was the last big Netflix Nurse Ratched and stuff?
Yes, back she came.
But so stylized and so obscene and so harrowing, but so entertaining and so beautiful. It's all these things, So I don't know. Difficult question to answer.
You're in the territory of Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom, which I tend to support by and large, but doesn't work. Brendan, what do you think about popular culture and representations? Does it help you or hinder you in the work that you do?
This, popular culture misrepresents everything. If you're a policeman, if you're a Garda, you're not accurately represented in popular culture. Their work isn't represented. It misrepresents everything. Some people do find it upsetting. Particularly, popular culture inevitably moves toward the dramatic, and it's quite unusual to see a sort of very sober depiction of sort of day-to-day mental health care. Somebody who might be depressed is prescribed an antidepressant or cognitive therapy and slowly gets better over a period of 4 or 6 weeks. Like, it doesn't make for riveting viewing. So we have to live with that. I would like to see more accurate representations. It does make a difference. But if you take something like Nurse Ratched, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I certainly use that as a teaching tool. It is a great way to talk about the perils of institutions, and even more broadly, not only the way institutions treat people, but the way society uses institutions to funnel its desires. And we see this in Ireland more than anywhere else, as our psychiatric hospitals in the 1950s, they were bigger than all the other institutions put together, bigger than if you added your prisons to your orphanages, your industrial schools, your mother and baby homes, all of them. The psychiatric institutions were several fold bigger than all of them put together. And we literally cannot continue to ignore this in our history. So popular culture is a really good way of exploring that once we do it thoughtfully.
Well said. Rick, what's you would have, I suppose, more exposure to American culture, which is the kind of dominant culture in the world at the moment in terms of representations of mentalists. What's your view?
It's almost like a three-sided coin when it comes to the representation. Like when it comes to the news, the social media, it's a lot of times it's dramatic, or the dangerous part, or the spontaneous, that an excuse that mental health can be to explain a situation or a story, a headline. It can be so dramatic, but then within their cultural and their cultural things, movies, TV shows, they can show very fluid episodes of mental health that are very understanding and very clear. And like you said, for like American culture, it is so influential worldwide. Whether it's their movies, their programming, their broadcasting, their books, their novels, a lot of their they do have a lot of influence when it comes to our society. We can't say it doesn't. So once we see a sort of a balance, I rather that it can't be just black and white. It can't be right or wrong. It's got to be fluid, as they say, because that is how mental health is. It is a fluid. It is a concept that's changing. It's forever a new understanding of how it is, and a new feeling of how it should be is continuous. So as long as we don't always go to the extremes of it, I'm happy, because mental health is two words that make up so much. It's not, you cannot just say that is it. Like, I have a diagnosis of bipolar or a diagnosis of borderline personality, but those are two words that do not represent me. There's a massive huge overflow of what I am. And it's not just because of mental health, it's because of existence. It's because of where I was born, how I was raised, everything. So to say mental health just represents me, no, it can't, it will not. And just like how one society or one show portrays mental health, it's not the way it always will be, or not always as it is. So I think pop culture is changing, as always, as we are. So I hope we'll just keep changing to the better part of it, and more of understanding and openness about the conversation for it.
It's interesting that particularly a lot of female celebrities these days are talking about their mental health, and even on occasion cancelling big events because they're worried about their mental health. And that is raising the debate, and I suppose normalizing the fact that people do have, at different times in their lives, quite serious challenges that they have to contend with. And that this should not be ignored just because you don't have a broken leg and it's obvious there is something wrong, and you should be taking care of yourself. So I suppose we'll finish up by one quote that has come into my mind a couple of times, but particularly while you were talking there, is Hamlet, when Hamlet says, I think it's to Polonius, "Wouldst thou pluck out the heart of my mystery," which is a way of saying, don't categorize me, don't label me and think that that's all I am, which is what you were saying just now, Rick, that there is no one description for any complicated human being. And we have to remember that there's far more to everybody than any diagnosis that they might receive. We'll finish up. I just want to ask all of you if you think that things are moving generally in the right direction in the way that society views mental illness. I know social media is an issue we haven't really got to. It might be something that one of you might want to comment on, because that seems to be a place where a lot of both outrage and offense taking is perpetrated. But are we getting more empathic? Is it because more people are coming out and talking about the fact that they have suffered mental health issues at one stage or another? Are we getting better or worse? Brendan, start with you.
I have found it necessary to believe that we are getting better, and I'm going with getting better, because there is I'm a psychiatrist. I'm very attuned. When I hear something, I listen to it. I pick up on it, and I hear the conversations again and again on radio and elsewhere. But each time that conversation happens, it might sound very similar to previous conversations to me. There are new people hearing it. And so I think it's really important that the sports players, that the pop stars, and that if they're comfortable to speak openly, do so. And if they're not, don't. I do think that's helpful. In terms of our mental health service provision and the way we support people, there is a lot more to do if we are to understand that better. And the final point, if I may, is we have generated a culture of physical fitness where people are either exercising to be fit or feeling guilty about not exercising to be fit. The idea is there. I'm not quite convinced we have placed the same value on mental wellness or psychological wellness. So I would like to see, beside every gym for your physical health, I would like to see some kind of sort of support for mental well-being as well.
Great idea. What about you? Are we better or worse, or getting better?
I think, I'm really lucky to be part of a community that's full of kind of neuroatypical people, if that's a different way of saying it. I mean, artists are creative. They make very significantly bizarre choices to do these art-related things across the entire, and I'm going to say spectrum, but it's not, in terms of what practice can fulfill and do and achieve. So I'm surrounded by odd, different people who think differently. And that's really kind of fantastic, because it allows for a wide range of different thoughts and things to occur and to be achieved. And, the world is a better place for art and artists. So, I mean, beside every gym, there should be an art gallery, right?
Maybe that's what we need. We're redesigning the architecture of our towns and cities as we
Great
speak.
stuff.
Rick, last word to you. Do you think we're getting better or worse at managing these issues?
I think we're obviously getting better. We're more vocal about it. We're more open about it. We talk and we demand more about things. So yeah, we were going in the right direction. Art therapy is one of the best things I've ever done in my life. So you can always have that next to the gyms. And like you said, the mental and the physical health, there's a connection. There always will be. I know a lot of mental health organizations use, runs and walks for their charitable things. And it's great, because I know exercise does help the mind. It does keep the drive going, the testosterone and it's a good feeling that you have after you exercise. But it's hard to do when you're in bed wanting to, just close away the world. So, if we have a balance of understanding our mind and our mentality, our body as one, commonality in between ourselves, it'll be a lot better. But yeah, we're definitely going in the right direction. I can't say we're not there where we need to be, and we're not going to be there for a while, and we can keep screaming that we're not, and we can keep wanting better. But yeah, we've been going upwards for a long time.
It's a lovely, hopeful note to end on. And on behalf of our audience, I want to thank our three wise men here who have given us so much insight into this really important issue, which could go on for hours. I mean, we could talk for such a long time about all the aspects of this subject. The language itself, what it denotes, what it meant in the past, what it means now, changing societal attitudes, the experience itself, and how people handle it and what's available for them. Anyway, thank you for being with us tonight. and for supporting Grangegorman Histories. There will be other events like this in the future, so keep your eye on our website to see when they're coming up. Good night and keep safe.